the okay recording. Wait. So we will be having a book survey on the books of First and Second Kings. But before we start sa ato ang presentation yun, let us first watch a video owned by Bible Project so that just so we will have a background about this book para dili ta maglisod sa pag-forward nato no, dili ta ma-confuse sa uban nga mga terms and all. So I'll be presenting a video. This is about 8 minutes long. So sige, I'll do it now. So, tell me guys ha if dili siya mo next. Wait, okay, here. Okay.
The books of
Go
1st
over,
and 2nd
guys.
Kings. Although they're two separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a
Go over,
unified...
guys.
Yes, Jack.
Okay, sige. I'll start it from the beginning.
The books of 1st
Okay.
and 2nd Kings. Although they're two separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focus on Jerusalem, first with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple that he makes some really horrible choices and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20, and then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. And the most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both build altars and pray to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elisha. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door, or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it. He's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the book of Kings.
Okay, so that's the end of the video, guys, and I hope that you were able to somehow have a glimpse of what the book is all about. So what we are going to discuss karon. Okay, so now let's start na siguro. Okay, okay, here. So first, okay, these are the contents of our book survey. So first, we will be discussing about the overview and the background of the book, its authorship and date, the historical setting, the structure, the purpose, special considerations, unique features, specific advice in reading, key verses, mega themes, and the theology of the book. Excuse me. So to start off, okay, we will start with the overview and the background. So, kabalo naman siguro mo unsa overview and background from the name itself. Okay. So here. First and Second Kings is actually a tragic and a traumatic story, for it tells of the numerous dumb decisions made by the Israelites that eventually led to the death of God's beloved nation of Israel. Okay? Second, kani. First and Second Kings is the concluding episode in the story of Israel that runs from Genesis 12 through 2 Kings 25. 2 Kings 25. So First Kings picks up the story immediately after the ending of 2 Samuel. So thus in First Kings 1, David, which is the central character in First and Second Samuel, is old and about to die. So in First Kings 2, David dies and Solomon, his son, becomes the king. Now, the books of First and Second Kings received their names because they document the reigns of the 40 monarchs of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah following David. So Israel had 20 kings and Judah had 20 as well, including one female who usurped the throne, Athaliah. So here, no, in the Hebrew Bible, First and Second Kings were one book until the 16th century. So the ancients actually regarded them as the continuation of the narrative which began in Samuel. And the Septuagint Greek translation of the Hebrew text, dating from about 250 BC, was the first to divide Kings into two books. So that division actually has continued up to the present day, karon. So the Septuagint translators, however, called these two books 3 and 4 kingdoms. So the first and the second kingdoms were our First and Second Samuel. And Jerome's Vulgate Latin translation, which dates to about 400 AD, changed the name from kingdoms to kings. So muna na siya karon na kings na, First and Second Kings. Okay, next. Here. First and Second Kings are the last of the former prophets' books in the Hebrew Bible. So the others are Joshua, Judges, and Samuel. Now, the original audience for First and Second Kings was probably the Israelites who had been carried off into exile in Babylonia. So here, I have to explain something, no, that with Jerusalem burned to the ground, these people no doubt struggled talaga. They struggled just to make sense of everything and to maintain some kind of hope. So why do you think did this happen? Is it because of the Lord is unfaithful to them, or maybe perhaps he is just weaker than the gods of Babylon. So now, First and Second Kings will provide a very clear and important answer to those questions that I said a while ago. So now, as we can see here, the exile came as a result of Israel's and Judah's repeated and continued obstinate disobedience to the Mosaic covenant, especially Deuteronomy. So, looking back or pondering back to what I said, the great tragedy of this story is that they had only themselves to blame and nothing else. So, next, there are several significant sub-themes running throughout First and Second Kings. And one is the portrayal of the dismantling of the spectacular empire and the temple that Solomon built. Okay, so here sa kanisha nga part. So the early chapters of First Kings, 'di ba? It describes how Solomon, kung paano si Solomon nag-add ng mga various valuable items to the temple. The later chapters also of the book describe how those items are carried off by various foreign kings. So now, here another sub-theme in First and Second Kings traces the reversal of the Exodus and the conquest, which is Israel's salvation history. So when we recall to the conquest, so the Israelites, di ba, they entered the land and they captured Jericho. So here in this book, at the end of Second Kings, it is Jerusalem that is being captured. And the Israelites are being kicked out of the land. So ironically, the final king, which is Zedekiah, is captured by the Babylonians right outside Jericho. So yun, ending Israel's time in the land where it actually began. So here another sub-theme introduced in the Elijah and Elijah stories is that of a remnant. So as the nation slides into apostasy and thus heads for national judgment, the Elijah and Elisha narratives illustrate that there is hope and deliverance for individuals who trust in God. A remnant will survive. So now let's move to the authorship and the date. So here, the dates and chronology of First and Second King, guys, are they are interconnected, and they are quite firmly documented good through the ancient world history of the previous era. So now Solomon comes to the throne in 971 BC and reigns until 931 BC. So you can see that in 1 Kings 1 to 11. After his death, a civil war ensues and the nation splits into two parts. So here, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. So the northern kingdom, Israel, is destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BC, and Judah is destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 or 586 BC. So now, Paul House also believed that the same writer composed Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. So the father of the Deuteronomistic theory of authorship, Martin Noth, he believed in single authorship, but in an author who lived in the mid-6th century BC, the Deuteronomistic theory is that the writer of the Kings, as well as the writers of Joshua, Judges, and Samuel, wrote using Deuteronomy as the standard by which they evaluated what Israel and its leaders did during the years those books record. And next, the identity of the writer is unknown today. So Wala pa gyud siya, and has been for centuries. And ancient Jewish tradition suggested Ezra or Ezekiel as possible writers, since both of these men were inspired writers who lived after the Babylonian exile. Now, so let's continue. The record of King Jehoiakim's release from Babylonian captivity points to a date of final composition sometime after that event. So Jeremiah has traditional Babylonian Talmudic support as well, though Jeremiah apparently never went to Babylon but died in Egypt. So also here, most non-conservatives date kings considerably later than the 6th or 5th centuries. And the historical period kings covers totals about 413 years. The events that frame this period were Solomon's coronation as co-regent with David and Jehoiakim's release from Babylonian exile. However, here, most of Kings deals with the period that spans Solomon's coronation and the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, which is a period of 387 years. So to explain kay medyo complicated siya gamay. Now, no, di ba it is said here in the previous slide na the identity of the writer is still unknown until today. So wala pa gyud siya and has been for centuries. So of course, by upon looking at this, someone else may have written Kings siguro, because even scholars, they have suggested that these men, gisuggest rin niya nga mga men katakong dimension, because they were the famous writers who lived when Kings reached its final form. And also here, sa next, no, kaning sa last part, however, most Kings deals with the period that spans Solomon's coronation and the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, which is a period of 387 years. So at the beginning, we see that the temple is built, and at the end, the temple was burnt. So mo ni siya ang pasabot ani sa reign or sa time ni Solomon. So now, let's go to the historical setting and the purpose. Now here, kaning nga book, First and Second Kings, wala siya comment jud concerning the circumstances of its composition. But as noted sa ganina na historia nako, its contents and its completion in the exile, it suggests a possible scenario and purpose. So here first we have the exiles probably interpreted Jehoiakim's release as a positive sign. So perhaps a harbinger that their captivity might soon end. So ayaw mo kalibogan ng harbinger, guys. Pinaslangan na siya dira, pero it actually means ragyod na. It is actually a sign, muna ilang sign, redundant siya, sige, go ka na. So it was a sign, a positive sign for them na, uy, our captivity might soon end. So now, next we have second, okay, here, Jeremiah. Jeremiah had written to those deported in the first and second deportations, advising them on how to live during the 70-year exile he prophesied, because Jeremiah is a prophet. So moto ni write siya ani ng mga people. And the third, after the exile, Zechariah still referred to that prophecy na gihimo ni Jeremiah. And Jehoiakim's release may have led the exiles to revisit its promises. And they even may have begun to ponder what a return to Judah might mean. Okay, so now let's move to the purpose. So this is the purpose of the book. So the purpose of First and Second Kings probably was to explain the exile, okay, and to prepare the exiles for the anticipated return. So here, to prepare the exiles. So to prepare, the exiles must reckon with the rebellion and idolatry, which is a string of covenant violations that had angered Yahweh and led to the many decades in Babylon. So, di ba, ningon diri, to prepare, the exiles must reckon. So they must make themselves believe with the rebellion and idolatry na mauni siya ang makapa-anger or makapasuko ni Yahweh. And the history contained in First and Second Kings confronted them with the reasons for their tragic story and also taught them what to do to avoid repeating it when the opportunity to go home came. So, in short, no, I'll just have to explain you this part para in some points makaisabot ka or ano. So, the revived hope of return from exile became actually mo gini siya ang occasion for the completion of the First and Second Kings. So, di ba, its purpose was to teach the exiles the God-pleasing way of life na that would prevent them or that would prevent the past from repeating itself in the future so that they didn't ruin the future as well for the generations to come. And its message was actually just to, for example, here, to hold on tight to our God, diba? To never let go because there is hope, and above all, to obey what He says. So obedience is very important in this book, Yud, because it is seen in here, Yud, diba? That here to prepare the exiles, they must make themselves believe with the rebellion and the idolatry, which is a string of covenant violations. So these are violations that are against the will of the Lord or kana. So let's go to this time na the structure. Okay, here, the structure. So here now we have two structures actually. So structure A and B. So first, let's start with the structure A. Now, for number one, the reign of Solomon, the reign of Solomon, which is in chapters, you can see that or you can read that in chapters 1 to 11. So, kani siya nga part, explain lang ko gamay. This is, Solomon actually inherited a strong monarchy, di ba? Ni-inherit siya of monarchy and he reigned for 40 years. So, moto, iyahang reputation as a monarch kay naka-center gid siya sa iyahang wisdom ba, iyahang great wisdom, which is clearly seen na siya sa chapter 3, especially in chapter 3. Na dito gid siya makita that the reputation of Solomon being a monarch was actually centered on his great wisdom. And also sa chapter 4, his reorganization of the administrative bureaucracy pod kay somewhat mapod sa una nga panahon ani nila, they were politically inclined mupugod pa. So somewhat ato na siya i-discuss later on because actually it became kuan po siya also siya ka factor nga naka-affect the division sa ilang area. So that would be discussed later on. And also kani siya maugid ni in chapters 3 to 8 na ani siya makita dito his building of the magnificent temple. So naa dito tanan makita. And then actually kay before man if we go back due to Samuel, di ba? Actually si David nagkuan gyud siya na mo-build yung temple but it was not yet the time for him to build a temple because God niya si God na dili pa to ang time na mag-build siya. So it was his son Solomon na iyang successor who built the temple. So dire na to na makita. So as you can see, no, Solomon is perhaps one of the most overrated na kaya siyang figure sa Old Testament. So because in spite of his mga achievements in wisdom, he is still recorded as having 1,000 wives and concubines. So, siya. And in fact, Solomon had little contact with the people of his realm. Sa unang time, dili siya, wala siya contact sa mga people. And he even used these people pagyud many of them in labor battalions in his vast building program sa una for the economic advantage, for the economic disadvantage of Israel. Okay? So next we have here the early divided kingdom. Ingon ko nga short no pero taas di ay siya. Sige na. Let's move to the second part. The second koana. So the early divided kingdom. So this is in chapters 12 to 16. Kita niyo siya nato dito. And kaniya siya na part the Deuteronomistic authors of 1st and 2nd Samuel and the 1st and 2nd Kings kay they attribute to the failure of unity kinaaman to. So ni-fail ang ilahang ilang attribute unta for unity to Solomon's construction of the temples for his foreign wives. So mo ni siya nga part na sa dinhi. So guys, don't be confused of the Deuteronomistic ha. It is actually a law nga sa una mo ni siya ang katong sa unang nga time nila katong i-prohibit dili pwede ang mga idolatries so mo na siya idolatries and disobedience of God. So mo na siya ang Deuteronomistic law before sila na time. Now let's move to the prophets and the kings. So here kani siya medyo taas-taas gamay ako mastorya siguro ani. But later on, ayaw mo kabala ka guys, I'll just explain ginagmay lang. So kani sa prophets and kings, kani nga part, so if we go to first, kani siya kay First Kings man siya 17, 1 to 2, di ba? First Kings 17, 1 to 2. So before tamu ani sa, let's try to go back first to First Kings chapter 16. Kay kani nga time, si Ahab, he became the king of the northern kingdom of Israel and he married Jezebel. So katong nakita ninyo ganina sa video, di ba gipakita to siya. And kani si Jezebel, she was a princess. Prinsesa ni siya guys, prinsesa outside of the covenant. So she was a devoted follower gani of Baal, which is a false god that commonly worshipped among the kinainay sakto. And together, kani si Ahab ug si Jezebel, they promoted sila og mga idol worship, no? Mga idol worship in the northern kingdom of Israel. So idol worship, upon hearing that, and during those times, it was prohibited yun itong mga time. But the Israelites continue, nagpadayon silang pagpakasala. So kani siya, mo nga time that kani si Ahab ug si Jezebel, they promoted idol worship in the northern kingdom of Israel. So kani nga time, during this time good, the Lord sent a prophet. So muna ni ana ang prophets. Nagpadala si Lord og mga prophets. Specifically named si Elijah to siya. And he delivered a message to King Ahab. So katong reason siguro no. Ani lang naro ko na ponder upon saying those things. No? The Lord may have sent Elijah to provide evidence of his power and Elijah's calling as a prophet good. Because katong time, naman to yung mga drought before. So nato drought, and it might also help to humble down Ahab and to encourage him and other Israelites who had strayed from the Lord to repent. Because, as what I've said, nagpadayon ni sila silahang pagpakasala. Israelites during those times. So now, let's go to the late divided kingdom. So kani siya, dili na ako ni explain siguro kay related naman siya sa katong mga na-divided na kingdom. So muna ni siya mga disunity, katong walay mga unity before, especially between the people of Judah and other tribes. So those rebellions or those disunity were actually present during the reigns of David and Solomon. Ato nga mga time, present gihapon. So now, let's go to, nadi ko i-add ato di ay. Katong rule during the United monarchy nga katong na-split na sila from Northern Kingdom to Southern Kingdom, kuan na to siya nga time, nag-continue ra gihapon siya until tong na kuan na tong gi-burn na ang temple, so nagpadayon nagyapon to siya sige. And here, Judah alone. So sige na. Next na ta, structure B. So here, sa structure B, there kay kumano ani kay I will be explaining this later on. So just a short one lang. So the contradiction of Solomon, which is splendor and apostasy. So you can read that in 1 Kings 1 to 11. So here there is a Solomon's failure in the relationship with Yahweh based on his ethical mga ethical parts niya or mga ethical and rational appeal ni Solomon. So mo ni siya is his failure with his relationship to Yahweh. And second, reversing the conquest and dismantling the empire. So which will be read at 1 Kings 12 to 16. And the third, God sends prophets to confront the corrupt monarchy. And fourth, the last days of Israel. And fifth, the last days of Judah. Okay, so now, guys, let's move on to the special considerations this time. Okay, madungog ako, guys. Update lang. Kaya basig ko na ako nadunggan. Kadayon ako yaw-yaw. Hello?
Klaro na, Jet.
Okay, so thank you. Okay, now let's go to the special considerations na this time. So the books of Kings are filled with chronological data. No? The author dates the building of the temple 480 years after the Exodus. So here he provides figures for the length of David's and Solomon's reigns, and it also gives explicit information on the reigns of all of Judah's and Israel's kings. So kani padaan siya, guys. This is very complicated na siya, no? Because if we coordinate these datas, kani nga mga datas, the chronological data, with Assyrian or mga Babylonian and other mga extra-biblical records, it would really be a challenging task for us. Kay knowing how long a given king reigned does not actually establish precisely when he reigned. So, yun, it is still possible that the manner in which the Northern Kingdom dated the reigns of its kings was different. Pwede siya lahi sa manner sa pag-date sa kung unsa ka taas na ang pag-reign sa mga kings sa Southern Kingdom. So, kana siya, it could be different yun siya. So that's why it will be a challenging task yun. So this could somehow gani alter our understanding of the overlapping dates na and of the kings in Israel and the kings in Judah. So, ana siya, guys. We also have to consider that because it is complicated, kan siya, kanang challenging kay siya nga task because different mo ta kung ganina, no? It could be different kung unsa kataas ang pag-reign sa kings sa northern o sa southern. So now, additionally, the possibility of co-regencies in which two successive kings of Judah or two successive kings of Israel ruled at the same time for portions of their reigns may mean that what we might think is the beginning of a reign is actually the beginning of co-regency. So go-overlap na ta. And this would mean that the total reign of two co-regents is actually shorter than if we were to add the total number of years given for each king's reign in 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay, so example. For example, no, we have here an example. A co-regency between Asa and Hezekiah would indicate that a total of approximately 33 years passed between the ascension of Asa to the throne and the death of Hezekiah instead of the 45 years that we get if we simply add the given lengths of their reigns together. So if i-add siya nimo, mas longer siya. So in fact, if dating the reigns of mm, Asa, Hezekiah and Manasseh is kuan siya. This is very difficult. Why man? Because kuan siya, which we have to consider that we must be mo ni siya special consideration. So the dating, when we date the reigns of Asa, Hezekiah, and Manasseh, it would be difficult for us. Why? Because it means that we must be content at the present with the approximate dates sa gikan sa pagsugod and hangtod sa pag-end sa ilahang reigns. So, in any case, there are some dates man pod that can be established with relatively na mga little doubt lang, dili kita magduda ani nga mga dates. So, naapod siya ingon ana, and also the dates of the fall of Israel and the fall of Judah are known. So, kani siya katong mga dates sa fall sa Israel and sa Judah, they were all known with some certainty. So these are the major dates that can be calculated from them. So I'll be showing it to you in the next slide. So here, muna siya. Dates that are widely accepted. So muna siya mga dates niya gidawat. Okay. First, we have 970 BC. At this time, this is the end of David's reign. And 970 to 930 BC, this is where Solomon started his reign. And in 930 BC, this is where the division of the kingdoms happened. And 722 BC, this is the fall of Israel. And in 586 BC, this is the fall of Judah. Okay. So next, let's move on to the unique features. So can you guys, ako rin yung basahon dire nga part sa unique features, because later on, ma-explain na gihapon ni siya sa pag-abot na sa later parts. So para dili ito redundant kayo. So here, Solomon's spectacular building accomplishments are contrasted with his inexcusable apostasy. And second, it records the building and dedication of Israel's first temple, which lasted nearly 4 centuries, so 968 to 586 BC respectively. So you can compare that in 1 Kings 5 to 8, dito na siya makita, with 2 Chronicles 2:7. And during Solomon's reign, Israel attained its largest size, ever much larger than the present day Israel. So Solomon not only solidified, but he also extended the gains made by David. And in 1 Kings, we find the exciting story of Elijah's confrontation with hundreds of false prophets on Mount Carmel. And 1 Kings 17:22 records the first of 8 bodily resurrections besides that of Christ, and is recorded in the Bible. And next, 2 Kings records the final 2 of 3 Old Testament resurrections for the first. So here, Monisha, you can see it there. Okay. And next, it also records the second of 2 men in the Bible who left this earth without dying. So also, it records the second and third of the 3 occasions when God rolled back the waters of the Jordan River. And 1 and 2 Kings also records the second Old Testament miracle involving the rotation of the earth around the sun. And also, the Elijah and Elisha stories contain more miracles by God than any other time in the Old Testament since Moses. And lastly, God deals with the bad kings of Israel and Judah in different and unpredictable ways. So later on, guys, man-revel rin siya nato as we go on with our survey. Ay, break di ay. Sunod. Hira. Guys, so kani nga part, since break man siya, so actually, okay raman ta akong upadayon, but sige, let's give it a chance to have a break. So ani nga time, we will be having a game. May pag-game si Mayora. So, sige, friends, take it over. Naka-friend. Hello, guys. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Oy, ayan.
Hello.
Nasa-friend. Go. Mo stop pog
Okay.
share.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you.
Sige,
Makaroon
guys.
ako?
Okay. Kaniha, take a break sa ta. Mga pila lang ka minutes, maybe mga 5 minutes siguro. Just so kuan na to, refresh na to itong minds before we go on with the later parts. Kaya medyo daghan ni siya. And I'll be discussing more about yun sa book. So, para dili po ta kuan, TMI, or too much information. So, sige, mag-break sa tangtanan. Okay? Friends, take it over.
Hello.
Copy ka, Franz.
Wait lang. Off-cam na lang ako. Sige.
Take it away,
Hello.
friends. Take it away, friends.
Okay,
Go.
legit. Klaro ako? Klaro lang.
Choppy gamay, pero kaya rin.
Hello. Okay.
Sige, friends.
Sige. So karon break time na to. So let's make it more interesting, no? I just want to ask for everyone nga mag-join. Katong gusto mag-join pala and available nga mag-join to open their to open their cameras. Hello. Ayan. Just to open cam, ayan. This game is very common na gid kaayo, no? Like dili na gid kailangan siya kahit ang hatag pag instructions or whatsoever. But ayan. Si Jeka nagkatawa na. So, hello Kuya Obed. Thank you Kuya Obed. Si Ate Trixia. And by the way guys, nani siya price. Nani siya price. So, yun no. Okay, sa Ferdinand Cloud. Thank you, bro, for opening your camera. Sige, kamo lang mag-join. Ayan, Naimel. Sige sa pa may gusto mag-join diya. So, this game is called Bring Me. Bring Me nga game. And I know nga familiar gid kayo mo ani kasi familiar ani. Can I see any reactions? Ayan. So, this game is called Bring Me. So, Bring Me. Nangutana. Unsa to po? Pilay price daw. Kuya Dens. Apil na lang ako Kuya Dens. Makita na nimo. May bawaan na nimo Kuya Dens. Uy, gusto ko mo apil. Okay. Sige. To start it, sige. Ano nga? So, dili na kailangan ng example, right? Di na kailangan ng trial. Okay? So, direct na ta, guys, ha? Direct na ta. So, we have 5 entries. So, ang rules lang is just ipakita lang din nyo sa camera. And for those first na makapakita sa ilahang item nga akong ihatag karon, and Aga will help me. Ags, okay lang ba? Aga will help me to to see kung kisay una. Okay lang ba? Ags?
Sure, bro. Sure.
Okay. Okay, sige. Let's start this. Let's start na. So, okay. Maghatag og pila man ka seconds mga sige, hatagan na lang ako og pag wala gyud like 10 seconds. I will start it to 10 seconds. So, first item. Okay, ready na ba guys? Can I see any reactions? Ayun, okay, ready na. Okay, so first item. Ito. For those mga students, makarelate yun dani. Bring me a whole pad of yellow paper. A whole pad of
Si Mel, wala. Nakakuha na si Mel.
Ay, si Mel.
Yay.
Sorry,
Okay,
Doc.
guys,
Sorry, Doc Obed. Nakauna si Mel. Okay, congrats, Mel. Ayan, congrats, Mel.
Trial pa
Okay.
daw to, trial.
Oh, trial. Hindi, wala na trial. Grabe sa agawin. Okay. Mel, 1 point. Thank you, Kuya JM, for taking out. Next. Okay, next ha. Kani, mailan yun. Okay. Bring me, ipakita niyo sa camera. Bring me wine glass. Okay? Wine glass. Wine glass. Wine glass. Sino may wine
Uy,
glass sa inyo? Uy,
si Trexia.
Ate Trixia. Ayan, si Ate Trixia. Yay! Congrats, Trix. Ayan. Merong wine glass. Tapos ano, may wine glass. Actually, gibutangan na ako siya nga item, no? Kay wala may wine glass sa balay. Wala lang, na-curious lang ko. Kung naaba sa inyo ha. Okay, si Trixia. Okay, congrats, te. Bring me Apostle Paul. Sige, next. Okay, next. Ito. Okay, bring me 20. 20. Pero barya. 20 na.
From the top.
Okay, okay na?
Oh, Jack. Klaro na. Thank you.
Sige, ay isa ha. Kay nihang lagi akong laptop. Hello. Wait sa ha. Okay na siya. Tapos kani, dili nawala ang. Sige. So we will start with the specific advice in reading. So this view of things is also accented by several structural matters. So first, all the kings are placed within the story by means of a common regnal formula. So we have a formula to follow, guys. So first, when a king came to reign in Israel or Judah in relation to another king, so like what happened to David and Solomon. So see, Solomon was he is the successor of his father David, and also the second one, how long he reigned and in what capital. So unsa kataas siyang pag-reign, how many years, and asa nga capital, could it be in the northern part or the southern part. And the third one is for the Judean kings, the name of his mother. And the fourth one, his religious policy. So for the northern kings, this consistently takes the form of following in the sins Jeroboam, son of Nebat. And for Judah, the issue was whether the king followed Yahweh and whether or not he removed the high places. And number 5, often the source for further information about the king, and at the end, information about his death or burial and who succeeded him. So, kaning sa item number 4, guys, mo ni siya ang only basis on which a given king is judged. So, no matter how long he ruled, bisag unsa pa siya kataas nga ni rules sa usa ka kingdom, or what his other exploits or accomplishments might have been, so dili na siya mo matter. And also, item number 5, it tells us, the reader, where the other kinds of materials might be found. It could be, for example, in the book of Annals of the Kings of Mainana. So now let's go to the purposeful disproportions of the major kinds. So here, second structural matter may be, for example, trying for those who might want to read the history. Kani magong first and second kings. This is more on history. What happened before? Kinsa ang mga kings na ni-rule? How many years sila nag-rule in Ana? So many of the kings have almost nothing said about them beyond the regnal formula. So kanira gid siya ang main basis on how to read the book. And it was also narrated about those people apart from the accounts of the Civil War. So almost altogether, their loyalty and mga disloyalty to Yahweh. So it is all there. Makita gina siya in every part of the book. It is stated there as a reminder dito siya, reminder na disobedience and mga idolatrous na deeds sila. will really lead to the fall of the Israelites and to their nations. And that's the reason why it results to a purposeful disproportions of major kinds. So we have here the second one. So first, mo man siya, no? And the second one, the overlapping reigns of Jeroboam the second of Israel, the 41 years in Samaria, and Azariah of Judah, 52 years in Jerusalem, are merely skimmed in 7 verses each. So which is makita na siya sa 2 Kings 14:23 to 29 and 15:1 to 7. So while the 22-year reign of Ahab and 29-year reign of Hezekiah cover the several chapters, kani sila, kada usaani nila, they cover several chapters of the book. And the third one, this also accounts for the disproportionate space given to the prophets Elijah and Elisha. So, kanisha, they become God's agents in the holy war, but now they are over against the northern kings themselves and the foreign-born Baalist Jezebel. So through these people, through them, God demonstrates that He is still Lord over all the earth, including His creation, the nature, and even the nations of Israel. So He is still the Lord over everything. And thus, like what I said a while ago, the Deuteronomic cycle brings the glory to its crashing end sa northern part, diba? And eventually, the same thing happened in the south in terms of the promised exile. So, Moto, we just have to remember here, kay, mostly good, we will be discussing it about what happened sa ilahang time. How they, naunsa sila pagka-fall, ano ni siya, it's because they continued to sin, the Israelites. And here, lastly, note that in contrast to the book of Samuel, this story is eventually told in the context of major superpowers that have arisen, Assyria, then Babylon, and Egypt. So here, put na part, they become the instrument of God's judgment that drive His people from the land. But they do so, no, because Yahweh is the God of the nations, and He has brought them into power for this very purpose good. So here, makita rin gihapon na tong sovereignty ni Lord, aning a time that He even uses people. He used people as an instruments to show His power, and to show His sovereignty. And next, so amora to siya, guys, no? The key to everything is whether even a given king has been loyal to the covenant with Yahweh. That is very important sa kaninga book. And here, let's move on to the key verses. So, kanin siya, okay, I'll be showing you the verses. Wait for a moment here. So the first verse, as David's time to die drew near, he commanded his son Solomon, saying, I am going the way of all the earth, so be strong and prove yourself a man. So it is seen in 1 Kings 2:1-2. And next, you know that David, my father, could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. So, mo ni akong gingon ganina, guys, that during the time of David, katong sa 2 Samuel, wala pa gud to, wala pa, dili pa to ang time na mo build si David og temple because napa to sila yung mga conflict ato, mga dagan pa kayto silang conflict. So muna siya gingon diri, but now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune, and so I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord said to David my father, your son whom I will set on your throne in your place shall build the house for my name. So which is Solomon. And this can be seen in 1 Kings 5:3-5. Now, here, but the Lord said to David, my father, whereas it was in your heart to build a house for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. And it can also be seen in 1 Kings 8:18. And next, until the Lord removed Israel from his sight, just as he had spoken through all his servants the prophets, so Israel went into exile from their own land to Assyria until this day. 2 Kings 17:23. So guys, mo choose pa mi og topic for our exegesis ani. We still have to decide asa ani nga topic, so we'll just inform you. And now, okay, so before I move on to the mega themes, so there are certain themes in First and Second Kings na nag-clarify siya sa mga plot and the characterization. So most of these ideas actually just came from Deuteronomy gyud. And first, mo to akong gingon, di ba? First, God expects Israel to obey the stipulations of the covenant. It was said in the video a while ago, and nato sila katong they have to obey the stipulations of the covenant, and even the kings, katong mga kings, they must act according to the rules in Deuteronomy. And also mga idolatry, they must be avoided, and the law should be followed good. And second, it is also said nato ganina na discuss nato that God rules history. So ipakita gihapon ng sovereignty ni Lord that He rules above everything. Walay lain, only God, even the history. And the Creator controls kings and nations also. So moto siya. So third, moto nga na natay mga prophets, and they arise and preach repentance to a sinful nation. And fourth, katunaning time nga the temple is built, which mo ni siya ang nag-fulfill sa 2 Samuel, and nag-establish na sa Jerusalem as the central place of worship. Diba? So, mo ito siya. Sacrifices can be offered only at those special sites that I mentioned. And lastly, sa mga key verses na kung giingon ganina, going back here. Kuan, that God will forgive and restore Israel good if they repent. If they repent. So kani siya nga mga ideas, it does not only appear actually in the first, it does not only appear in the First and Second Kings nga book, but they can also be seen on Joshua, Judges, and Samuel. So mo to siya nga giingon ganina sa ato sa overview and background, if you can remember. Authorship and dates, if you can remember that kaning mga authors sa First and Second Kings, nag-offer siya sa mga readers og similar or mga familiar nga concepts. So that's the reason why kay makatong nga mga authors, they were also familiar way back sa pag-complete sa First and Second Kings. So now it's time for us to move on to the mega themes. Now here we have the nature of the monarchy. So the book stresses that the monarchy is not a right, but a God-given task, with conditions attached and articulated in the Davidic covenant. Okay, next, David himself instructs Solomon on what God expects of him and the risks to the dynasty of not pleasing God. Faithfully obeying the law of Moses is the condition Israel must meet for God to remain with them and ensure the king a long and prosperous reign. So mo tong gingan ganina guys, just take note of this. Faithfully obeying the law of Moses, ang mga laws before. And God twice reiterates this point to Solomon in connection with the temple, perhaps lest the king think that the temple wins him a waiver of those demands. So here, the book later holds all Israel responsible for the same disobedience that ended in the national doom. So, mo na to siya nga time nga ato na ni siyang i-unravel diri nga mga part. So, the book also ties the judgment on Solomon with his failure to meet those demands. So, di ba? wala sa mga kings na kamit ato nga demands gyud, especially in the northern kings, mga northern kings, 0/20 gito sila. But in the southern, there were 8. And the same conditions apply to God's promise of a dynasty for Jeroboam, the northern kingdom's first king, whose reign similarly ends in judgment for disobedience. So always take note of this, guys, the disobedience here. This is the very main highlight sa tuang gikuan karon. And also, second one, okay, here, we have the, before we proceed, no, kanang let's just try to kuan this one. And I have something to say lang po. Kay, for example, no, let's put it in an example. Like mother, like daughter. So, like example, unsa imong mama maupog ka? Ay, sakto ba? Sure. Dito. So, inana. No, so here, if we try to, if we try to connect this to the surveying atong gimo karon. For example, like king, like nation. O, di ba? Rulers have actually a powerful influence good upon a nation, or for good or for bad. So normally, if ang king nag-rule sa nation kay godly siya, or he is a godly king, then the people will fear the Lord. And if there is an evil king pud na mag-reign sa nation, then there would be in any case that the people will tend to fall into greater immorality na gyud and idolatry. So, however, dili mo pud tanan ani nga kuan ha. We just have to remember dili pud tanan kay there are exceptions man pud, like ato nga kung giingon, such as the kingship of Jotham. Kani siya, he was a loyal king, kuan kini siya, and he obey ni siya sa kuan. Gustong mahitabo dito na no idolatry, to obey ra gyud. So mo ni siya ang exception, dili tanan ha. And moto, a common refrain for the kings of Israel is that they did not depart good from the sins of Jeroboam. So moto nga nagpadayon ang Israel. So he made Israel to sin. So mo na to siya, nagpadayon ra gihapon, but not all. There is an exception. Okay, I just have to say that kay basi nagtuo mo nga tanan pud niya ba. So ana lang. Okay, so next, let's go on to the second mega theme, which is the fulfillment of the prophecy. So because there were, the wicked leadership of many of the kings of the two nations, the northern part and the southern part, this is the time where God raised up prophets. And these prophets serve as a check and balance against them. Okay, we have to take note of this. Check and balance. Para mo balance rin sila, guys. So God raised up prophets. And the prophets passionately insisted on undivided allegiance to the Lord and his law, opposing any alliance or political posture that might jeopardize the distinctiveness of Israelite religion. Okay, so next, the strict adherence to the covenant often pits the prophets against kings and queens who were willing to compromise in politics and religion with Israel's neighbors. Although the writer gives most of his attention to Elijah and Elisha, he mentions many other prophets. So which are Nathan, Ahijah, Shemaiah, Micaiah, Jonah, Isaiah, and Huldah. So here, the prophets were the prime shapers of events in the history that First and Second Kings recounts. Okay, so aning nga part, kaning mga prophets, no, as you can see, kaning mag-underline na ako. Kani silang Nathan, Ahijah, Shemaiah, kani silang mga prophets. So the prominence of these prophets in the First and Second Kings, that is why dili kita ma-surprise why 11 times the book highlights that something spoken by a prophet will later came true. Matinuod yun siya. So indeed, in one respect, the prophets in First and Second Kings differ niya siya from the prophets with books in the Bible, like sa Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Hosea, differ niya siya. So the latter actually speaks primarily to Israel as a whole people, while the former primarily speak personally to the ruling monarchs about their fates. So we just have to remember, guys, katong if naka-remember mo sa show sa video, ang nag-link sa historical events sa First and Second Kings is not actually human initiative. So dili siya tungod sa kanang kuro-kuro ra sa mga tao ha, dili siya inana kanang ganing murag tagna lang inana. But it was actually Israel's covenant God. So ang kaning mga prophets sa First and Second Kings, wala ni siya naitabo lang for kanang mga human initiatives lang gyud, but it was Israel's covenant God who speaks through his prophets and guides his people's destiny. So you have to remember that. Dili kuro-kuro sa tao, but it was Israel's covenant God who speaks through his prophets and mo ni nga iyang gi-guide ang iyang mga people through their destiny. And sa First and Second Kings pod are actually sent by God. So as we can see here, as kuan, they are mga messengers, di ba? They primarily function good as messengers, and their works mark God's corrective action in response to the nagging breakdown of the royal obedience in both Israel and Judah. So, dako kay role pud ang prophet because God speaks through them. Okay? Now, next, let's go to the division. The roots of the division between the northern and southern kingdoms were long-standing and deep-seated. So, kanina history, this is important, guys, to trace. And important ni siya para matrace na to ang mga previous events. Kaya nag-provide niya siya mga important reasons for the division. So, we have here, in Genesis 49, Jacob blessed his sons and the tribes that would descend from them. Judah received a special blessing. He would rule over his brothers, and the great king would descend from him. Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph, also were given a privileged position among the tribes of Israel. So during the period of the conquest, Judah received the first land allotment, and Ephraim received the second. So during the settlement, Ephraim twice attempted to establish a kingship in Israel in its allotment. But kani siya nga time, these were unsuccessful. Unsuccessful ni siya during aning time because God had other plans for them. So he rejected the tent of Joseph, and he did not even choose the tribe of Ephraim. But unsa man iyang he chose the tribe of Judah instead, the Mount Zion which he loves. So mo to nga he chose David as his servant to shepherd the people of Jacob and the inheritance of Israel. So, mo ni siya, guys, the rivalry between Ephraim in the north and Judah in the south continued through the reigns of Saul and Solomon. So when Jeroboam and Ephraimite led the revolt that resulted in the division, he said the following to the northern tribes: "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel, look now to your own house, David." So we can see that in 1 Kings 12:16. Okay, now next, here, the inevitability of judgment to befall Israel and Judah and why it happened. So this theme debuts in Deuteronomy, recurs in the Davidic covenant, and many times in 1st and 2nd Kings. It appears as early as in Solomon's prayer for the temple and God's answer to it, as well as in divine condemnation of Jeroboam. So its climax is the lengthy post-mortem. The writer gives to detail the reasons why the northern kingdom fell and the detailed treatment of the southern kingdom's destruction. So, kani nga theme, nagplay ni siya jud og a prominent role sa book nato. Sa purpose sa book, mainly to prepare its exilic audience for its eagerly awaited restoration good to Judah. And by detailing here the rationale for the judgment about to end, First and Second Kings taught them what God required them both to go home and to avoid a replay of the past. So kabalo naman mo guys, I mentioned it, what God required. Okay? So, okay, next. Okay, here is the last part. We're down to the theology. Okay? So theology na ta. Now this is the theology. Okay. The sovereign goodwill of Israel's God, the Mosaic and Davidic covenants, and the reality of prophecy are the theological pillars. So these are the theological pillars on which the first and second king rests. Okay. So now let's start with the Davidic covenants this time. So kanina nga part sa Davidic covenants, God promised David that he would find a royal dynasty, that ang mga people ni God, they would always be ruled by one of David's descendants. And the covenant has only two stipulations. We have here first. Davidic kings are to remain exclusively loyal to Yahweh alone, to Yahweh alone, rather than abandon Yahweh for other gods or worship and serve them alongside Yahweh. And second, we have here, they must obey the laws, statutes, teachings, and ordinances that comprise the Mosaic covenant, especially as Deuteronomy articulates them. So kani siya guys, kaning duha ka what do you call this? Considerations. Dili gini siya pwede mabulag. They are inextricably bound to each other good. Meaning, dili ini siya mabulag. Because if to love God faithfully is to do what the Torah says, and to obey the Torah, it shows that one loves God. And kani siya, both stipulations, the first and the second one, they must be satisfied for Israel to enjoy the covenant's blessings. So now, okay, let's go to the Mosaic covenants. Okay. So number one, the Mosaic covenant supplies the stipulations of the Davidic covenant and so enjoys theological primacy in First and Second Kings. Its provisions govern not only Israel's monarchs, but also its people as a whole. So we have to remember this, yun, nga both the king and the people, not only the king, but both, mo bitaw to, di ba? As I mentioned a while ago, God raises a prophet as a check and a balance para to balance everything. So here, going back here sa Mosaic covenants, both the king and the people are to carry out what the Deuteronomy stipulates. But although here, the king is specifically responsible good to lead the nation, just for them to practice the covenant faithfulness. And that's the main reason why the need for a righteous king rings across the first and second kings. Okay, so next, okay, let's go now to the Torah carries with it blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. So the promised blessings for obedience include, okay, here, abundant prosperity, protection from enemies, and the admiration of other nations. So the curses, on the other hand, the curses promised are more numerous than the blessings, and they are just as terrible as the blessings are wonderful. So that's the reason why, kanino, disobedient Israelites can expect to suffer, like mga drought, famine, even mga agonizing diseases, or mga gruesome defeats by their enemies. So they are all expected to suffer from this. Why? Because, the covenant framework of relationship with God, it underlies the summary principle that governs in the first and second Kings. So, kaning ilahang mga acts, kaning lang mga actions, or ilahang mga kaning gibuhat nila, naano siya ay connection sa mga consequences na pwede nilang madawat. And so, mo ni siya. The second one, conduct that pleases Yahweh results in divine blessings, while reprehensible behavior yields disasters at God's hand. This cause and effect theological principle explains why the invasions of foreign armies enjoy such success during the reigns of disobedient kings. Okay. So next, we have the prophets speak officially for Yahweh in the first person. So here, the prophets speak officially for Yahweh in the first person, expecting that their audiences will respond to them as they would to Yahweh himself. So the primary social role of the prophets is actually correcting errant kings through personal messages from sovereign Yahweh. So those messages drive the book's central plot thread. So the connection of a prophetic word at one historical moment and its fulfillment at a subsequent one. So here, First and Second Kings makes it clear that the destruction of Israel and Judah happened because they rejected the prophetic warnings to change their ways. So muna ilang reject. So you-reject nilang prophetic warnings. So that's the reason why wala gihapon, wala gyapon nabuhat, because there was a prophetic warning to change their ways in order for them to escape the imminent divine judgment. So muna nga na-destruct gihapon sila. They were destructed because they ignored the prophetic warnings. And here prophecy displays a fundamental theological truth that God cares so much about his people. He so passionately desires that their covenant relationship flourish and flower in blessings, that he repeatedly speaks to them in their own best interest. Rather than abandon them, he tries to get through to them through his prophets. Okay, so next we have here the sovereign goodwill of the Lord stands. So echoes of God's long history with Israel appear throughout it. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who rescued their descendants from Egyptian oppression, entered into a covenant with them, and settled them in their land, provided them human leadership, and defeated their enemies. So these memories, kani nga mga nanghitabo, they all attest to Yahweh's unwavering commitment to his chosen people. No, grabe si Lord. His unwavering commitment good, even despite the fact that Israelites continued to disobey him. Okay? So more gihapon, he is still the same. Walay nagusog niya. And next, God shows his sovereignty in two modes. So primarily, he shows his sovereignty by means of public acts. He twice appears to Solomon, and he sends armies to defeat Israel and defeats armies to save them. And he sends fire on Mount Carmel to display his greatness, and sends Isaiah to reassure Hezekiah. He launches future events by commissioning Elijah and Elisha. So occasionally, God's sovereignty also adopts an indirect mode. So that is working behind the scene. So this is an indirect way sa pag-intervene ni Lord sa itong life. He could be working behind the scenes. So Rehoboam's decision not to relax his policies proves to be a turn of events from the Lord. So God ensures that the decision fulfills Ahijah's word to Jeroboam. the sovereign God of First and Second Kings is very much in charge of his world. And finally, here the tone of the book strikes, maybe it would strike some readers as harsh. Kita, basi makaingon ka nga, oy, harsh man kini nga book. But we have to take note that this book, the First and Second Kings, also rings with divine grace and divine patience on every page. So many times God gives the Israelites much more than they deserve. So first, no, despite their idolatry, God generously preserves one tribe for Solomon and permits Jeroboam an additional generation of rule. And despite their waywardness, God gives the Israelites many victories. And through every judgment, calls them back to himself so they may experience the full blessings of the covenant. And even evil Ahab's moment of humility wins God's grace. And God is unwilling to destroy even idolatrous Israel. Even the blustery general Naaman receives healing, a newfound faith in Yahweh, and a prophet's blessing as he returns home. So kani siya, kaning blustery general na si Naaman, nagkuan siya, he personifies kani siya nga man. He personifies the believing foreigner who comes to know Yahweh. That was through an anonymous Israelite, so who is young, and he is, I think, a captured servant girl nga nihatag og advice ani niya kani si blustery general. So kato nga girl, he gave this man an advice. So that's the reason why nga the God of First and Second Kings shows his sovereignty in both direct and indirect ways, even both in judgment and grace, and to both Israelites and believing foreigners. So I think that's the end na guys of our presentation. So we are done with the theology of this book. So maybe we will now proceed to our, pero later na siguro, ako sang ihatag sa prophet ang time, okay? Because we will have a breakout room just to discuss mga duha ka questions. So these are the questions. Okay? So sige, ako na lang basahin ng questions so para makaponder mo daan. So these are the questions I prepared. Okay, first question. God is more concerned with our character than our competence. So how does this both encourage you and challenge you today? And the second question, where in your life do you need to be reminded that God's plans will always come to fruition in spite of human sinfulness? So, but later on ni guys, ako sa ihatag ang time nila ni Friend of the Aga. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jeka, for a very wonderful na presentation sa book of First Kings and Second Kings no na survey. I hope you guys are blessed, and I hope you learned something from the presentation. And I praise God for a successful one. Na wala ra gyud ta na kuano na stop kayo. And I praise God for the people behind all of this presentation. So as Jeka said earlier, we are going to have a breakout room, but I think it's going to be a short breakout room lang because it's already 9:24, and of course we have to be aware sa time pod. And I think before mag breakout session mag picture ba kuya, or should we?
Yeah,
Yeah, I think mag picture daan before, or stop na daan karon ang recording.
stop recording.
Sige.